On today's episode, we're going to talk... I f***ed up already.
To start over, it's fine.
On today's episode, we're going to talk about Joyce Manor's sophomore album, Of All Things I Will Soon Grow Tired, and Paul Thomas Anderson's love letter to milkshakes, There Will Be Blood. What is the connection between the California pop-punk band and the award-winning film based on an Upton Sinclair novel, you may be asking? Don't worry, we're going to answer that in no time at all. Meanwhile, we'll be discussing why Of All Things I Will Soon Grow Tired may be the black sheep of Joyce Manor's discography, if Paul Thomas Anderson has trouble remembering his actors' names, and what we love or hate about both. So for all things that make you feel sad, bad, or generally just not rad, welcome to Existential Shred.
Love that.
Thank you. I guess I should introduce myself. My name is Jordan. I am not part of Beam Out of the Mainstream. But go ahead.
People haven't picked up on context clues. I am not Antonio or Duff. I am Levi.
FKA Spuds.
FKA Spuds.
Which it'll be funny if like the timelines don't line
Add
up. Yeah.
No, like, what's going on with all this?
Yeah, who's the new guy? Not the new guy. The new guy who sounds like the old guy. But yeah, so welcome to Existential Shred. Like I said, this is for media that doesn't really leave you in a good place, I would say. I know with Beam, it's a lot of nostalgia, kind of recapturing childhood, like wonder, things like that, things that are significant to you. But with this, it's kind of the opposite. It's things that make you feel horrible as an adult.
It's in a weird place too, because I mention it all the time, but I love things that like I love whenever a writer or musical artist like is able to capture those feelings inside you without knowing you whatsoever. Like
Yeah.
To me, it's like they're a master at their craft if they can really dredge up these feelings inside you. So these tend to end up being like my favorite kinds of movies, which are just kind of like emotional drama comedies, like dramedy, black comedy, stuff like that. So I'm really excited to be doing this.
Yeah, that's the one thing, like, a lot of the movies I really like are ones that, like, make me feel like I'm having an anxiety attack. Like, and that's such a, like, people don't want to feel that throughout their normal day, but there's something so interesting about, like, a piece of media being able to pull that out of you. And I think it's just really worth, like, examining.
Yeah, there's going to be some things that we cover on here that I've stated before in the past where it's like, it's not for everybody, but it's something that I feel somebody should watch once, no matter what.
Yeah.
And I've unfortunately have subjected some of my friends to things like that in the past.
Might be subjecting them again to
Yeah.
it sometime soon. So yeah, I figured inaugural episode, I had this idea. I wanted to talk about Of All Things I Will Soon Grow Tired by Joyce Manor and There Will Be Blood. For one specific reason. We'll get into if it's a legitimate reason or something I kind of just made up. But we'll start with Joyce Manor. So Joyce Manor are a band from Torrance, California. I would say they're really known for two big things, and that is having incredibly short albums and quite an amazing live show. They're kind of the, like, really carried the torch for bands, I would say, like, even though they're not directly, like, super inspired by them, bands like Green Day, Blink-182, where it's, like, kind of a really, like, early Green Day, Blink-182, where it's really, like, punk influence, but it is pop punk, so it's a little more accessible to the general audience, but really, like, the ethos of punk is there.
I agree with both of them, but the amazing live shows are, I've been to, I think it's like 3 or 4 Joyce Manor concerts now with you.
Yeah.
And they're just some of my favorite live shows. Like, it's a thing about, again, just like a sense of community, and like you're there and you look next to you and it may be somebody you don't even know. We get split up all the time at shows.
Yeah.
And then we're next to random strangers, just like everybody's singing along at the same time. And it's just like, this music's touched so many people that they feel the need to be there and do that. And like, I've even had random situations where like random strangers, I'll be saying, they just throw their arm around me and we're just sitting there in unison, just like.
Yeah, I think about when we saw them in at the Agora with Prince Daddy. That was a lot of that, where it was like that crowd was just so into it, and like at the same time, like you're just connecting with these random strangers and like having really like Joyce Manor seems to be one of those bands that like gets people into this type of music, like emo, new emo, pop punk, more punk flavored, just general like alt rock, and people really connect with them, and people have such visceral emotional reactions when they get to see them live because it is such a spectacle. Like they are so good at performing live, and it really it's made them stand out. And just for reference, in terms of short albums, so it took me a little under an hour to drive here. I listened to their self-titled album, their debut. Of all things, I will soon grow tired. Never hung over again, their third album, and the half of their split with Toys That Kill, which I'll probably talk about at some point. So for reference, in about 50 minutes, I listened to the first three Joyce Manor albums and half of the split they did.
I mean, it's the meme, right? It's like, oh, I just listened to a whole Joyce Manor album 5 minutes later.
But yeah, so to get into Of All Things, I Will Soon Grow Tired, it was released April 2012 on Asian Man Records and Big Scary Monster, which...
I didn't know it was Asian Man Records. That's the... I can't remember his name off the top of my head right now, but...
Mike Park.
He works with the other guitarist from... Why can't I think? One of my favorite bands, RX Bandits.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I think they are part... If I remember correctly, they're partners on that.
I didn't know that. Yeah, because it's the guy from Bruce Lee Band.
Yeah.
Who works with Rosenstock. I think AJJ is very closely related to a lot of things on Asian Man Records.
A lot of old ska bands.
Yeah.
Which RX Bandits was a ska band before they diverged into more of a like punk progressive rock sound.
Yeah, there's a lot of like, even when you start at kind of the surface with the with the records labels that they were working with, there's a lot of really interesting information about Joyce Manor. Like specifically, one of the things I didn't realize, and I kind of found out going through this, was Joyce Manor was originally like a folk punk band, and they were super inspired by AJJ, formerly Andrew Jackson's Jihad, hugely influential folk punk band, especially in the modern age. And like you see it a lot. I don't know if you listened to that album that they put out recently, where it's the compilation songs from Northern Torrents. A lot of like the front half of that is very like folk punk inspired. It's very like acoustic driven, and it's very like I never connected the two. And then it started making sense as I was looking into this. Like, of course, they'd be inspired by AJJ if they're doing that kind of sound, and then they're working with Asian Man Records, things like that.
I never realized that they were originally going to be a folk punk band, and that actually makes a lot more sense for some of the tracks on Of All Things I Shouldn't Grow Tired. But.
Yeah, exactly. Which plays into some of the themes on the album too. Like, there's a lot of I found an interview where he's kind of explaining like the weird position that they were in with self-titled and Of All Things, which I'm just going to call it Of All Things.
Yeah, that's a better way to do it.
Yeah. Where there's this idea when a band is first coming up that you have your whole life to write your first album. And then that's where a lot of the times bands hit sophomore slumps, is because you have literally your entire life to write your first album. And then you have probably, if you're in demand or like you're trying to maintain your momentum, probably like 2-3 years, especially now, to put out your second piece of work. And I found an interview in Kerrang where Barry, the vocalist and guitarist, he was talking about how the self-titled album felt like a best of for them, where it was like at that point already it was like their greatest hits. I didn't realize this, but Beach Community, that song was 6 years old.
I never knew that.
Yeah, he wrote that when he was 18, and it was released on self-titled when he was 24.
No shit.
Yeah, that, and which like, as an artist, I can imagine you're playing a song on your debut that's already 6 years old. Like, you're probably looking to change your sound already. And I think that's a lot of what fueled this album, is like there's a lot of interesting plays on like, what do we do? Self-titled was huge. It has still to this day, Beach Community is one of their biggest songs. They're going to play it all the time. Constant Headaches on there. That is their biggest song.
It's the last song on every show.
Yeah.
Like no matter what. It's amazing. It's such a good song. It's the one that like really, whenever I started getting into Joyce Manor, like really sold me on it, because that song is like, it's the epitome of that, like really liking somebody that just almost doesn't really pay attention to you at the same time, but also like having something happen, and then like it's just like, well, this is nothing, like no matter what. But it's a very interesting song.
Yeah, and I think what you see is like self-titled was so huge, and then, and just for reference, self-titled came out January 2011. Of all things, came out April 2012. So that's a turnaround time of almost like less than a year, essentially. And there's a lot of like, okay, we blew up, like we did the thing everybody wants to do. Our debut has this huge impact. Do we kind of keep in lockstep and just keep doing this? Do we go back to a sound that we used to have? Do we push the sound forward? And I think there's a lot of interesting stuff that has to do with like evolution of artistry, kind of wanting to go back to your roots, things like that. And even like one of the things that I read was they were really trying to impress Asian Man Records on this album, not in trying to be like, oh, we're going to sell 1 million records. They literally, like, I think the quote is, he said, I was eager for acceptance by the label that I deemed to be cool. So he was just trying, like, Joyce Manor as a collective was trying to make an album that the people on the label would be like, oh, you guys definitely listen to all these older bands that influenced you, things like that. And he even went so far as to say, like, it feels like, looking and doing some of the research, it sounds like he really resents this album. And I keep saying I just mean Barry, like, because I was able to find interviews with him, because I found a quote where he says, it sounds like I'm having an identity crisis, and I was. You can hear it throughout. There's a lot of like tension, and I think that comes with the territory of the position they were in.
Well, I think one of the things where we were going, which I know you sent me some questions beforehand, but I think it's the least Joyce Manor album sound wise. But that, going into now knowing what they wanted to do beforehand, it makes sense to me. Like, comes into that like identity crisis. Like, this is a Joyce Manor song. This one very much doesn't sound like a Joyce Manor song. Covered video kills the radio star.
Yeah, which there I want to talk about that one specifically. And like to your point, I think at the time it came out, like it didn't feel like a Joyce Manor album. I think retrospectively, like now, it's so interesting to see how a lot of the songs on it now sound like things from like $1 Million to Kill Me or 40 Ounces to Fresno. You can really see a lot of the influence.
And I think that's probably why this one has gone a little less listened. Like, this is probably my least listened to Joyce Manor album up until recently when you said we wanted to cover it. And now, like, the first time I heard it, it didn't fit to me. The first two that really captured me were Self-Titled and Never Hung Over Again. And those two are like Never Hung Over Again seems like it picked up right where Self-Titled left off.
Yeah.
And you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like, it goes straight into like the same style, everything. And then getting more into the ones after that, like, I guess actually Cody was probably my least listened to.
Yeah, that was, I think, from like, I feel like they can be, like, you could designate Cody or Of All Things as Black Sheep, but for very different reasons. I feel like Of All Things stylistically is almost the Black Sheep. Like, it's the one that doesn't really define the sound of them at a moment.
Yeah.
It's kind of calling back to like an older sound, pushing forward like an indie sound, and then still remaining in the pocket of like punk music. But whereas Cody, it just feels like that was the least well received.
Yeah, it was probably because it was like 28 minutes long.
Yeah, that's way too long. I could listen to Of All Things twice.
Yeah, exactly.
I was thinking about the question, and I know I asked you previously, like, why does this feel like kind of the Black Sheep? And I found something that I thought was interesting, where Self-Titled, obviously huge. It made a bang. Of All Things came out. It did decently well. But one of the things that I didn't realize is Never Hung Over Again is their highest charting album.
Really?
Yeah, so it released and hit 106 on Billboard.
Okay.
So I think what happened, and why Of All Things is kind of forgotten, is Self-Titled is so well known for the reputation it garnered, of all things was an immediate, like, within a year it was released,
Yeah.
and it was kind of a weird stylistic departure, and then Never Hung Over Again is their most commercially successful album. So of course you're going to forget about the in between.
Yeah, it just fell to the wayside. People listen to everything around it, and then it's just like I completely forget about that album. I always forget it's their second. That's the thing for me is like I always think of Never Hung Over Again as their second album, and then it's not. It's their third.
You know what also is so interesting is if you look on Spotify, it lists Of All Things as their first album.
Well, I think that's because isn't that because of they don't have the original release. It's just the remaster, isn't it?
They have both.
Oh, they? Okay.
Yeah. Which, side note, because I thought this was interesting in doing all my research, one of the things that Barry, again, apparently really resents about the self-titled album is how it was recorded. I didn't realize this. I always thought it sounded very unique, but I didn't dislike it. Apparently half of the instruments were recorded digitally and half were recorded, I guess, naturally, for lack of a better word. And he was like, yeah, the way that certain instruments cut through each other just sounds really unnatural. And I didn't realize that. And as I was listening to it today, I was like, I don't know. I don't think it sounds bad. Honestly, I think the remaster sounds really flat.
Yeah.
But yeah. So I guess when we talk about Of All Things, like, what are some things that really like stand out to you, or like songs that really stand out?
I think in general, it's like sometimes the guitar work in it, there's a lot of departure from, again, but as we've talked about a lot, it was a departure a lot from the self-titled album. It seems like there's like, I don't want to say it's clean. I have trouble when I describe some of the like sounds that I'm hearing because I like music a lot, but I also don't know like what effects make what sound a lot of times. One of the biggest things first off is on these kind of ice skates towards the end that like whenever there's just like other vocal recordings in it as well, like it just becomes a cacophony of sound that kind of doesn't become like distracting at the first it is, but then you start really hearing it all come together like as a piece in general. And that's just something that I'd never heard on any Joyce Manor song like previously before.
One of the things that I think that immediately stands out is there's a lot of different production techniques that they use. It's not as straightforward as an album as something like Self-Titled, where there's a lot of extra instrumentation. There's like that vocal sampling, and it kind of, even with the vocal sample, it becomes very, like you said, cacophonous, but then it also creates like a swelling, and it seems like that's a production technique, but I think it's just like how that sample that they took creates like this swelling, like circling, like water going down a drain type of feeling that takes you into the second song.
But I do think like when I say before, like this doesn't always sound like a Joyce Manor album. Once Video Killed the Radio Star plays, like after that, the second half of the album very much becomes a Joyce Manor album to me. But I like, even though a lot of the things that were a departure, I think is what kind of kept me away from listening to this as much as I have in the past. I appreciate it a lot more now after listening to like $1 Million to Kill Me and 40 Ounces of Fresno. Like there are definitely some callbacks on those albums that originally came from here. Mm-hmm. But when I was on my own discovery of Joyce Manor and like Self-Titled, didn't really strike me on this one. Really, really love Never Hung Over Again. Still to this day, probably my favorite album that they have. But then like continuing to listen, I never ended up going back to this album until recently. And now I was just like, oh, I hear everything more, that like how the other albums have been influenced by this. But like Drainage, which we're going to talk about that, of course. But that's like an acoustic folk punk song, which again, I never like, to me, it was like, oh, it's weird that they would do that.
Which also in Drainage, it's very subtle, but there's a lot like that is if we're talking about like the different production styles that they bring to the table on that and like different production techniques, like that is the example of what's different about this album, because there's like a vinyl crackling that just kind of exists on top of everything. Very, very slow. The voice is the main driver, acoustic guitars in the back, and then there's also like a really subtle piano.
Yeah.
That you might not know. It's just hitting some like really low notes to basically accent some of the like the vocals that are going on, and it's just such a different sound. And like honestly, that's one of my favorite Joyce Manor songs.
It's a very, very good song.
Yeah, it's so unique, it's so different, and like it stands out as a song on its own. Like as a Joyce Manor song, like it would be weird to be like, yeah, this is my favorite Joyce Manor song out of what they're known for, but like as a song, like it's one of my favorite from them.
See, I think on this album, my favorite, which is also kind of a weird one, especially going back to me being like, well, this doesn't sound like a Joyce Manor album, but is See How Tame I Can Be.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a very, very like great song. It in general, I think the thing that was very weird and stood out to me in it is the drums sound very digital.
Yeah, they
And
are.
yeah, like I've imagined they are, but then as I was reading more, as looking up this album and going through it, I didn't realize that the drummer was literally replaced on almost every single album. They have a different drummer
Oh,
on
I
every
didn't know
album.
that either.
So I have a feeling that this may have been a song that was written like why maybe when they lost their drummer and they were like, well, we need drums, let's just digitally put them in.
Interesting thing about that song, so See How Tame I Can Be, and then also Bride of Usher.
Yeah.
They have a split EP with Toys That Kill, but the two songs that they contributed are covers of See How Tame I Can Be and Bride of Usher, where they make them more like Joyce Manor songs.
Okay.
So there's like a punk version of See How Tame I Can Be, and it's very straightforward. It's very Joyce Manor. For a while, before I started really re-listening to this album, I was like, oh, why didn't they just use this one? This is so much better.
Yeah.
And then like contextually within the album, I was like, oh yeah, it wouldn't have worked. When you're listening to the album, See How Tame I Can Be also really sets the mood for this is going to be different.
Yeah.
Because like you said, the drums are digital. It's a weird like bass tone on it too. It sounds really like rounded and like fat.
It gives it a lot more of an atmospheric sound.
Yeah, and it's like I don't think there's guitar on that.
Yeah.
So it's very stripped back and almost like a very like 80s sound. It's very strange, and it sets the mood for after these kind of ice skates, comfortable clothes, which are just your typical Joyce Manor outings. It's like you hit this third one and you're like, oh, what should I expect?
Yeah. What's coming next after this?
Yeah. I think one of the highlights for me on the album generally is there's a lot of like really great like lyricism.
Mm.
And I think they generally do really well with lyricism. It's very like almost stream of consciousness at points. But some of like one of my favorite lines I think from Joyce Manor comes from See How Tame I Can Be. And he's talking about I think it's the second verse. He says, in my reflection I watch myself watching TV and it's too much to take, and so I say to myself, I never told you that I love you because I don't. And it's just like, ugh. And I think about anytime I'm like playing a video game or watching a movie and the screen goes black and I just see myself, like I hear that in my head and I'm just like, oh, like when we talk about like how media that like comes from a place like that impacts you, like just those moments where you're sitting there, like maybe you're having a bad day, so you're like, you know what, I'm gonna watch a movie or I'm gonna play a video game, and then the screen goes black and you're just sitting there looking at yourself looking like a schlub, and you're like, oh,
Just melted into the couch or chairs. Like,
yeah. And I just always hear that, and it's such an impactful thing, and I think they've always done really well at really distilling a lot of like these emotions like loneliness and alienation and isolation. And I think again contextually with this album where they're like blowing up, they're the biggest band on the scene at this time because of Self-Titled, and then they're looking to put out this album essentially just to impress their label and be like, look, we are cool, like we love the bands that you guys love. I can imagine how alienating and isolating that would be for an artist.
Especially if it's like you're trying to do it for that reason, and like not that they're not influenced by those bands and love it, but to be like have the idea of just be like, I'm gonna write something that sounds like that, where you're alienating your own sound from what you normally do, just like completely going different from that.
Yeah, which like when I brought up like how they used to be like a folk punk band, so you're listening to this album and it starts off very Joyce Manor. You hit the speed bump with See How Tame I Can Be, and you're like, oh, okay, there's gonna be different. Then the midpoint of the album is a cover of Video Kills the Radio Star, which is one of my favorite covers.
It's a very good cover. I didn't think that I liked it the first time I heard it, because when we talked about this album years ago, you were like, oh, they covered that song, and I was like, yeah, well, Like that song to me is like also a perfect song. Like I've always loved that song. But I heard it and I was like, it's like I'm not really feeling it. But now going back after hearing all of Joyce Manor's discography and like being such a big fan of him, hearing him, I'm just like, I do really like that cover. It's great.
I love it. And it's so funny because I was sitting down and I was like listening through the album and I was taking all these notes, and like I have things like the themes of progression versus regression, both sonically and physically aging. And then I'm like, it's so interesting that they decided to pick that song because it fits thematically so well, where it's like the video killed the radio star is all about like the progression of technology, especially with like, because we have things like MTV, like people don't really care about the radio at this point. And I was like even thinking of like for them, like, do you progress in your sound? Do you regress to a sound that may not really fit where you're at the moment? Like, I thought it was very interesting to frame it like that.
So even thinking about like the background behind Video and the Radio Star, like I didn't even think about it musically, like because I'm always thinking when I hear that it's more about before there was TV, there were audio dramas on the radio, and then after TV became a thing, those just disappeared. Okay. Like think about like, you know, when the first War of the Worlds came out and it was a radio, like
everybody freaked out.
Yeah, because it just went straight into it. Like it didn't like, here's a broadcast of War of the Worlds by Orson Welles. No, it was just not Orson Welles, H.G. Wells, sorry. But Orson Welles did voice parts in it. But yeah, people thought it was real because it was so realistic at the time. And people started killing themselves, which is
is that real?
Yeah, that happened.
I know people freaked out.
No, some people like I've as far as I've read, that has happened.
I'm gonna say post-production me is gonna pop in here, and I'm gonna confirm or deny that allegation.
But I mean, from what I've read in the past, like there were people who jumped from buildings and stuff because they thought that the world was being invaded by aliens.
Post-production Jordan here. Quick fact check. I did find a Gizmodo article that put the death toll of the War of the Worlds broadcast between 6 and 20 people, but mostly due to rioting that occurred. No people necessarily flinging themselves off a building. So crazy.
That might be a rumor. Maybe it was just...
I mean, if there's one...
Yeah.
That's enough.
Yeah.
Getting back to Video Killed the Radio Star and like how it fits thematically. So I had like all these thoughts and I was like, oh, that's so interesting they picked this song and like how it really kind of represents where they're at as a band. And then I looked up an interview and they were like, yeah, we just wanted to make it a skate punk song. They're like, it doesn't mean anything. Like, shut up.
Quit thinking into it.
Well, no, I wanted to be like, are you sure? Are you sure?
Yeah.
It fits so well.
Are you sure? Do you even realize how well it fit?
Yeah. Think about your art, man. I want to not wrap it up with this album, but obviously there's a reason why we're doing a twofer. So 1 to 10, like where would you put this album at?
When I first heard it, I would say it was probably at a 3 for me, but listening to it again, I think it's probably, I'm going to double it and say it's a 6 out of 10 for me.
Yeah, I'm a little more generous. I'd go 7.8 out of 10.
Oh, I didn't know we were doing points. I'll give it a 6.7.
Ooh, okay. So it increased your score.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's super replayable. There's a lot of really great vocal moments. There's a lot of really great hooks. There's a lot of really interesting ideas. And I think that really lends it to being replayable. I think the only thing that really holds it back is if your album is essentially 14 minutes long, there can't be any fat. And I feel like there's a little fat on this.
Yeah. Yeah, I can feel that. I think for me, with going with like a 6.7 or 7-ish, like if I'm going to be like, I really want to listen to Joyce Manor right now, it's probably going to be self-titled or Never Hungover Again, or maybe even half of $1 Million to Kill Me. Mm-hmm. But this is probably one that I would listen to after I was just like, well, I'm sick of listening to those ones.
I think it's a super commendable album because they went into it off the success of self-titled and were just like, we're going to do something different. And even like I was curious because again, the meme of them making short albums, I was like, what songs did they play when self-titled came out? If they were headlining a show, like how did they fill their set list? And it seemed like a lot of the set lists I could find from that time, they were already playing these songs.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So like, I imagine it was just as artists, they were evolving and they put out this album that sounded sonically very different from what they had done already. And I just think it's very commendable.
I think like to get into real quick too, like bands that do that very well, I've always been like a big fan of, especially in their early years, but like Portugal the Man, who has become like so successful off of never having an album sound like the previous album. So for some bands that just really, really works, and then others it kind of falls flat.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, like I think at the time it fell flat for Joyce Manor a little bit because like we talked about, this album is very forgettable. But then going back and listening to it after everything else they've put out, it's like it sucks that it fell flat because it is a very good album.
Yeah, I feel like if they put it out now, it'd probably be like 40 Ounces to Fresno's good. I don't really return it to a lot. And $1 Million to Kill Me has a lot of really great songs on it. But again, I just don't like it doesn't hit me the way that a lot of albums do. But I feel like if they released this now, it would be, I feel like it would be well received.
I agree. Completely agree with that.
Two things before we leave. I found a fact that I wanted to share with you specifically. So one of the producers on of All Things is Jack Shirley, and he is known for a couple albums. I would say he has a pretty decent amount of albums under his belt where he's a producer. I also want to say there is another producer credited. Oh, Alex Estrada. So Alex Estrada has done work with bands like Touche Amore on The Beat of a Dead Horse. He also worked on Self-Titled. He's also worked on albums by Zilbalba and Nails, which are some like power violence bands. Nails just put out a great album, by the way.
You were just asking me about Nails.
Yeah,
the
they
other
were
day.
really good album they just put out. But Jack Shirley worked on Greatest Hits by Remo Drive. He has done basically everything with solo Jeff Rosenstock, including Worry, and the album that you once claimed was the best album of the 2010s.
Is that what was that?
Sunbather.
I was wondering. Yeah, I was gonna say, is it?
Yeah, it's such a weird to go from like this album of all things to like a shoegaze black metal album like Sunbather.
I want to throw out there, I don't recall if I said it was the best album of the 2010s, but I said that I think that they will turn into be one of the most influential bands whenever it comes to influence in other music. And I feel like we have now, mid 2020s, starting to hear a lot more bands that do have like a shoegaze aspect to them with like heavier vocals. There's bands like what was that band that you sent me more recently? Dreamwell,
yeah.
Dreamwell, which like is essentially more of like a punkier version of Death Heaven. I'm starting to see the influence now, and I was just like hearing them, just like I fucking told him.
Yeah, I'll give you that. It was right now. I'm starting to appreciate black metal influence things much more, but I think it's like I appreciate black metal as like an accoutrement to a genre where it's like all of the classic stuff I'm like, this sounds like it was recorded on a potato.
Yeah.
But you put some of those influences into it and it sounds great. But
I really do wish you would have come and seen them that time they played Coheed and Cambria, because it was really, really cool to see them play live.
Yeah, I bet it would have been cool. But after seeing Father John Misty 2 days in a row, my body just couldn't handle.
That was rough. That because I don't even think I took the next Monday off of work after that, and I was just like, oh man, my whole body hurts.
Quick aside, I love Father John Misty. He's one of my favorite artists of all time. He was in our city. I'm not going to dox us.
Oh, people know from the other one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we've said Pittsburgh before.
All right. So yeah, we went and saw him in Pittsburgh, and then I bought tickets to see him the next day in Cleveland. You, me, and Zach went on a little road trip, drove back, and then you had tickets to go see Coheed and Cambria and Death Heaven, and the plan was 3 concerts 3 days in a row. And I woke up Sunday morning and I felt horrible. And I was like, oh God, I should go. I feel like a bad friend. I've dragged him to go see Father John Misty twice in a row. But yeah,
there's no reason to feel bad about that. Those were 2 of the coolest concerts I've ever seen. But then that was just like a bookend to the weekend for me. And like, I had a blast. I mean,
yeah,
I sold the ticket, so it's not like it went to waste. So it was, nothing to feel bad about.
So why There Will Be Blood and this album of all things, I Will Soon Grow Tired? You kind of mentioned it already. There is a song that is alleged to be about There Will Be Blood called Drainage. Now, there's nothing substantiating this.
No.
I had it in my head, and I've told people, like I think I've told you, Yeah, Drainage is about There Will Be Blood. It's literally a comment on the Genius page for the song. And it's just like, yeah, this song's probably about There Will Be Blood, but there's no confirmation.
Yeah.
But Drainage, one of the last scenes in There Will Be Blood, he's talking about drainage. The song itself, very low key, calm, talking about like laying with you in a quiet place or laying like a brother in a quiet place. And one of the last scenes that is, in a way, how that goes. I don't know if I would say, Daniel was laying with Eli or Paul. I forget which.
It was Eli.
Eli, yeah.
Paul you only see at the very beginning of the movie. And
yeah, I don't know if I would describe that as quiet, but but yeah, that's the connection. So we're gonna hop over to There Will Be Blood, famously directed by Paul Thomas Anderson, who is most known for directing all of the Harry Potter movies.
Is that true?
No.
Like, wait a second. That's really funny. So I was telling Jordan about a bit that I want to do where I was like, oh, I want you to ask me what we're covering. And I was going to be like, There Will Be Blood by Paul F. Tompkins.
And then it turns out
that he's in the movie,
yeah,
which I did not know when I thought of that bit.
Yeah, not visibly.
No,
you hear
audibly.
Him, yeah.
Yeah.
Paul Thomas Anderson, he directed Inherent Vice, The Master with Joaquin Phoenix and
Philip Seymour Hoffman.
Yeah, R.I.P. And then he also did Boogie Nights.
Yeah. Joaquin Phoenix was also in Inherent Vice. He's the main character in that, I believe.
Oh, okay.
He does kind of tend to seem like uses similar, like a lot of the same actors. I think he also did The Phantom Thread, didn't he, with Daniel Day-Lewis?
That's not on my notes.
Okay.
I can't tell you. I only wrote 3.
I cannot confirm or deny that.
Yeah. But it is based on a novel by Upton Sinclair called Oil. I did a little research into it because I was really interested in like what made them pick this novel. Like what's so compelling about it. And like I've owned it at various times. I've never read it because it's kind of an intimidating book. It's decently long. And it seems very dense.
It's like, what, 530 something pages or so, 580, if I remember.
I guess depending on the edition. Yeah. But yeah, I don't know. It's a very interesting subject, and I mean like the movie is very dense and like it's a very slow burn, so it's been intimidating to like approach that. But what I could find is the co-executive producer Eric Schlosser, who is an investigative journalist. One of his, I guess, most famous is called Fast Food Nation, and he was inspired by The Jungle by Upton Sinclair.
I was so bringing that up, the novels in general, the old house that my family lived in was once lived in by my great uncles, and we had a bunch of their books like up in the eaves that we found one time, and both The Jungle and Oil were in there.
Oh, nice.
My one great uncle apparently used to read Upton Sinclair novels.
You know what's funny is I have The Jungle, and when I went to buy it, I like put it on the counter, and the cashier was like, you know, The Jungle, one of the presidents read it and then was like, I'm never eating hot dogs again, because it's so like it talked about like food industry and how disgusting it was at that time, because I think it was just so unregulated. But yeah, so Eric, investigative journalist, reads The Jungle. He produces Fast Food Nation, and I think at that point he just was really interested in Upton Sinclair's work, so he read Oil and he immediately bought the film rights to it, and he was trying to find a director, and Paul Thomas Anderson, I wrote PTA in my notes and I almost said PTA. Paul Thomas Anderson had come to him with a project, and it was just a script for a story about two families that were fighting, so I guess like Hatfield McCoy type thing.
Mm-hmm.
But it just wasn't like working out. Like I guess he couldn't fully flesh it out, and Eric Schlosser gave him Oil, and Paul Thomas Anderson was like, I love this, and he adapted the first 150 pages, and he's even quoted as saying like there's not enough of the movie to feel like it's a proper adaptation, so I think that's why they say it's like it's based on yeah. But yeah, star-studded cast, really centers around a very small cast. You have Daniel Day-Lewis as your star, Paul Dano, who was not originally even supposed to be in the film.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, somebody named Kel O'Neill was originally cast to play both Eli and Paul, and the only thing I could find from him is he's in a movie called Pulse, which has like a 46% on IMDb. So I think it was one of those things he was just like, yeah, this just isn't working, and he got Paul Dano.
Which I'll have to say good on him, because Paul Dano, like, I don't want to say he's an underrated actor, because I feel like everybody that sees him is like, oh, he's done such a good job. But I also don't see him getting, like, I feel like he doesn't get enough roles. Like, he could be in so many other movies and roles like this where he just is such a good actor. Like, there's times where he just seems like such a good guy, and then there's other times where he just seems like so slimy. Like, Paul Dano is very good at playing, like, almost any role that I've seen him in.
It's a really big theme for the movie generally, is like everyone just seems like such a snake.
Absolutely.
You really can't trust anyone's intentions.
I think the only person, like, just to go into that is, I can't remember his name in the film, but Ciarán Hinds' character, who's, like, he's Daniel's, like, right-hand man.
Ooh, it's funny you say that. His name's Fletcher, and
Fletcher.
I literally wrote Fletcher, right hand.
Yeah. He seems like the only, like, loyal person throughout the whole thing.
Yeah, and, like, to a fault, because Daniel isn't a good person.
No.
He's really not. And real quick, just because I referenced it in the intro, I want to bring this up. Paul Thomas Anderson can't remember his actors' names.
Really?
So Daniel Day-Lewis plays
Daniel because of that.
And Paul Dano plays
Paul.
He just let that thing sink in for a sec. Well, he only plays Paul in the beginning, so
yeah.
So I guess for anybody who hasn't seen the movie, who might not understand why we're calling Paul Dano both Paul and Eli, he plays a pair of twins. At first, you see Eli, and then later in the film,
you see Paul first.
Oh, my
Paul's the one that comes to Daniel and is like, "There's oil on this land."
So when we talk about Paul Dano, he is both Eli and he is Paul.
Paul Sunday and Eli Sunday.
Yeah. But yeah, there's everybody in the movie is, you can't trust them. They all have ulterior motives. And I guess to get into the story generally, so it opens with Daniel, both Day-Lewis and our main character. And he's down in like a mine shaft, and he finds gold, silver. He finds some,
I think it's silver.
Yeah,
mostly.
At first I was watching it and I was like, is he mining coal? Like, it's not very obvious until the next scene.
Yeah.
But it opens, you get a time, it's 1898, and he's mining gold, silver, whatever.
At this point, he's just a prospector.
Yeah.
Like
old, like really old-timey, like the get up and everything. Yeah. And he finds it, he sets some TNT to presumably better access everything so he can sell it. As this is all going on, he falls down the mine shaft. He fills his pocket with the silver, gold, and then this really like chilling scene where he's dragging himself out of the mine shaft, and he starts dragging himself just across the desert. And there's this wide panning shot, and you see there is nothing. There's nothing.
He is just like in the most secluded area of I think it's the California desert.
At that point, I don't think it is.
Okay.
I could be wrong, but I think they go to California later.
Okay.
But yeah, really chilling, because like he breaks his leg when he falls down. Like, it's very clear he breaks his leg. He can't walk, so he's dragging himself. And it cuts to him when you realize he's selling silver and gold, because there's like a notice of payment for silver and gold. And he's laying on the ground still in the office. So the implication is he dragged himself the whole way.
There's that implication, but also you do see like when he was trying to pull like all of his tools up before they explode, he did still have his gun up there. So he very well may have used that as a crutch to like walk the rest of the way.
Okay.
It does, like, even still, to have to drag yourself out of a mine shaft with a broken leg and then like across the dirt and to just make it through the desert on a busted leg in general is extremely impressive, of like just a show of fortitude and stamina, like,
yeah,
and survivability.
Yeah, and you get like a real sense that he has that like tenacity, like he has that thing in him that really drives him. You know, why it drives him or what it drives him towards, you're not really sure of yet, but like clearly he's somewhere, like he's out there. But yeah, starts in 1898. You then start to see kind of him getting into the oil business. Initially, he's working with a couple men. They're just looking to on a small oil derrick. Tragedy strikes, and he steals someone's son. In a way,
Yeah.
they would call it adoption now.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, but I feel like you go through a lot of legal processes for adoption, where there he was just like, "That's my boy."
Yeah, a guy gets his noggin knocked in.
Exploded.
Yeah,
It looks like an explosion whenever that hit. And like to go into what was happening, they struck oil. It starts filling up this well, so they're like legitimately pulling pails of it up just off of like a pulley system. But I can't even remember if there were pulleys, if it was just a rope. But the piece of wood breaks and falls down and just busts this dude's head.
and then they're like, "Oh yeah, he's dead.
He's gone.
He's gone." And there's a little baby who he would come to be known as HW.
HW Plainview.
Daniel just kind of, he's like, all right, I guess you're mine now. But one of the things that really stood out in that scene, and I think it's very really prevalent throughout, is like the religious aspects of the story. And I picked this up. I say that as if it's like a very profound thing, but there's a lot of really interesting parallels between things you see throughout the movie and then recontextualizing them in other manners. So one of the first, it was such a weirdly striking imagery to me, but when they first hit oil, they're all like, "We did it, this rules," and HW's real father is holding him, and he brings him to where they're pooling all of the oil, and he kneels down, he dips his thumb in the oil, the father, and then he puts it on HW's head, like you would see if you were doing like something like Ash Wednesday, where you get the ashes on your forehead, kind of like, I know that's not a baptism, but like a baptism in the oil. And that's also, it ends up getting mirrored later in the film with what I would say like the baptismal scene with Eli and Daniel much later in the film. A lot of really interesting parallels in that regard.
And I think with like the whole father doing that to HW was like, this is, we struck oil, we're good for the rest of our life. This is what is going to make you good for the rest of your life. So here it is. Like,
yeah, like going along with that, I think a lot of when we kind of examine like that period of the West, especially in the American West, there are a lot of themes of like modernity versus traditionalism. And we get that with Eli Sunday and Daniel Plainview. Eli shows up. He, well, I guess we should talk about Paul approaches Daniel after he begins, I think it jumps to 1911. So starts off 1898, HW is adopted in 1902, and then the story proper starts off in 1911.
That's like the biggest time period that we cover, or that the movie covers. Like a lot of everything goes on in 1911.
Yeah, exactly. And Daniel is in a town. He's trying to sell them like, hey, I'm an oil man, hire me. That's where Paul F. Tompkins, he pops in real quick. And then Paul Sunday approaches Daniel and he's like,
I want to point out too, when he's like trying to sell to the town, like, oh, I can do this and you'll become rich, or you can have multiple people coming in trying this. But the whole reason you start seeing like that he even adopted HW is he's like, look, I'm a family man.
yeah,
Like, this is my partner, my son. This is a family business.
HW is a tool.
Yeah.
Which I'm glad you said that, because that especially later in the film, that comes out a lot.
Yes.
Like, let's just put a pin in that. Let's make sure, because that's a really good point, and that's something that I think is really important to like the character of his character.
Daniel or HW?
Daniel.
Okay.
Well, I would say both.
Honestly,
Yeah.
both, yeah.
But Daniel more specifically.
Yeah.
But yeah, Paul approaches Daniel and he's like, "Hey, my family has oil under their land. Give me money. I'll show you how to get there. Talk to them. They're not well off. There's nothing grows anymore. They will definitely, whatever you buy it for, they will take it."
And he's also coming there just like, my family doesn't know. Like, I know there's oil there. And like, because he even says something about it being like, technically it could just be seepage, which he says, and he's like, no, trust me. He said, take the money, like, pay me. I'll show you exactly where it's at on the map. You just go and do what you do.
So he goes under the guise of pheasant hunting.
Mm-hmm.
He approaches the family farm, the Sunday family farm, with HW, and it's just like, I'm just here to hunt pheasants. And they go around, essentially, when I was remembering it, I just remember them like shooting And I was like, oh, they just shoot at the ground and see where oil pops up. But no, they do hunt. But they come across loose oil, which he says is from like an earthquake. And at that point, he's like, oh, okay, Paul is right. Like, there is oil here. So he approaches the patriarch of the family, and he's like, hey, I want to buy your farm. He's sick. He needs fresh air. This is what I'm willing to pay for it. And then in comes Eli, who... It's so interesting because as an audience, you have the same reaction as an audience as Daniel does in the film, because Paul and Eli are twins, but they never outright just say that they are twins.
He never said he had a twin brother. He just says, oh, my father, mother, sister, and like brother there. I think he has 2 sisters, but
yeah. And when Eli walks in, Daniel gives him like the side eye, and he's like, are you Paul?
He's just like staring at him and like trying to figure it out. But then Eli doesn't give any sort of like inkling that he knows who he is. And I think he picks up on it then, where he's just like, these aren't the same person, even though they look like the same person.
Yeah. And what Eli wants, because he's kind of negotiating, because the patriarch is just like, yeah, for sure, we can't grow anything. I will take any money you give me.
Yeah, this land's not worth anything.
Yeah. And Eli goes, well, hold on a sec. We know we have oil, and he's kind of like playing into it, and he's like, I also want money for the church, because he is looking to be a preacher. He's a spiritual man. And that's where like the first instance of you really get this like modernity versus traditionalism, where there's this, and it's going to be a theme for the whole movie, especially with these 2 characters. Daniel is very specifically like, he is like industrial revolution, progress, capitalism. At that point, you can make a lot of money selling a product, whereas Eli is very traditional. It's very community based, religious based. He just wants money for his church. And the funniest thing about the whole movie, which is not a funny movie, but the funniest thing about the movie is the whole time Eli, at every point, he's like, when am I going to get that $5,000?
Well, so he gives him $5,000 originally, but then he owes him another $5,000.
Yeah, he says, I'll give you $5,000 up front
Yeah.
for the church. I'll give you another $5,000, and then he never gets that other $5,000. And he brings it up like 2 or 3 times throughout the film, where he's just like, he's graciously offered to give me $5,000 that we're still waiting on. And it's like the funniest part of the movie at an otherwise not funny movie.
I do want to just point out there, just because this is an interesting thing to think about, but the deal was originally for $10,000, right?
Yeah.
When they said that. In 1911, $10,000 is equivalent to the purchasing power of $331,094.
They throw out a lot of numbers. They're
Yeah.
like he's throwing away money. And I when I think about like back in the day, I'm just like, oh, that's probably like $1 billion.
Yeah.
And he's like, I'll give you $100,000. I'm like, yeah, that's probably like $10 trillion.
But in order for like him to be like, this is what I'll give you, it just shows like he knows how much money he can make off of that.
Exactly.
To be throwing that kind of money around and to have that kind of money to throw around, he knows exactly what he's doing.
Yeah, exactly. And it plays into how bad of a person, and I don't want to say how bad, how
Selfish.
yeah, just how, I would say almost like if we're kind of sticking with this idea of like traditionalism and modernity, like what are Daniel's morals? What are they founded on? Because you see him, he lies all the time. He's a shifty guy. He uses his adopted son, as a tool. Like when in the first scene where he's talking to the Sunday family, they're asking him like, he's like, oh yeah, this is my son HW, and they ask him, oh, are you married? And he says, oh, well, my wife died in childbirth. And we know that's not true. As an audience, we know that's not true.
Did he say wife, or did he say his mother died in childbirth?
I wrote down specifically he said wife.
I couldn't remember, but I was going to say, because if he said mother, technically he wouldn't be saying a lie. It was just like...
Yeah, I'm pretty sure he said wife. But like you immediately, he's set up as an unreliable narrator. So you see him, he lies to the family. He's making these business deals knowing that he's getting over on people, even as scummy as it is, like to promise money to someone to build a church and then just to not pay them that money. Like it really brings into question like what is the moral ground that he stands on. And like it's very interesting as like a timepiece at that point.
None of it's based on like, for him, religion, because even like whenever Paul first like is introduced to him, he asked him if he's like a religious man and what essentially what denomination. He's just like, well, I like them all. I like all of them. He's like,
Yeah, and even there's a lot of like the battles between him and Eli are so throughout, because you see as Daniel's operation grows larger and larger and larger and larger. So does Paul's. He starts off.
or
They.
Eli's church.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah. Man, this is gonna be so difficult to follow. Yeah, Eli's church continues to grow. It starts off. They eventually Daniel has a big operation. It's essentially a town that's surrounded by an oil derrick, or an oil mining facility, whatever. And Eli starts off with like just this busted down shack in the middle of nowhere. With some of the money, he starts to build it and build it. And as both of them gain prominence, you see their conflicts become more and more, like they ramp up more and more. And I think one of the things that we should talk about is, like you said, how Daniel uses everyone around him as like a tool. So there's, I think, one of the best scenes in the whole movie where everything falls apart.
Oh, yeah.
For a bit.
Is this before the other guy dies in the? Remember the one guy dies
Yeah.
in the well.
No. That happens before. So yeah, that happened.
Because going into like the conflict between Eli and Daniel, whenever the man dies, he goes up to the church and he was just like, "Hey, I can't have my workers coming here. They're working all day round. They're coming here. They need to get rest. They can't be coming to your sermon." And he's just like, "I mean, I'm a church man. Like, these people come to hear the name of the Lord." He's just like, "Well, I don't like that." Essentially.
Yeah, and even with that, because that's right before they turn on the big thing that they're building.
Yeah.
I think in that interaction, he's like, "Hey, oh no. They visit, and Eli asks him like, I want to speak at the opening, and I want to say a couple words. I want to bless it."
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, "Yeah, sure, okay, we can do that." And then he just doesn't.
Ignores it.
Yeah, he ignores it. He has a younger sister who is good friends with HW at this point. They're young children, and he brings his sister, the daughter, up, and he dedicates it to her and doesn't let Eli speak. And you see, like, with the interaction you're talking about, where it's like, "No, I'm not. My men can't come here because they need to." Someone, essentially, he's blaming him for
the
that
death of that guy's death. Yeah.
Yeah, he's like, "Yeah, he was up here praising the Lord, and now he's dead." And then, "No, I'm not gonna let you bless my oil derrick." But then, after that is the big, I would say, one of the, except for the very end, the like the climax of the film, where everything falls apart. For those who haven't seen the movie, I don't know what to tell you. You're listening to a podcast about the movie. But one of the first nights that the oil derrick is up running, I think they hit gas.
Yeah, it was a pocket of gas.
Yeah, and that causes everything to catch fire.
I think what it caused first was like that gas is pushing all that oil out.
Mm-hmm.
And first what we see is just like all the oil shooting up the whole well and like just raining oil down everywhere.
Yeah.
But going in that, like, as we were seeing that too, where before everything goes wrong, HW is like super interested in like this. It's one of the first times he's up there.
Yeah, and when that happens, he's like flown back.
Yeah.
Like he is directly above the gas leaking. Like
Yeah.
the gas explodes out. He is right above it. He gets thrown back, and then everything, like, obviously oil's raining. Eventually, a fire's sparked, and I don't know if you know this. I did in some research surrounding this, but oil's very flammable. So
I did not know that.
yeah, crazy. So everything's catching on fire. This oil derrick that he's built is like his legacy at this point. The moneymaker for not only him but the town. It's going up in flames. And when we talk about like movies and like why they're effective at making us feel so on edge, I think this is such a good indicator of what makes this movie so eerie.
It's the music while this is all going on.
Yeah.
Where like the drums are just kind of like spastic. And then they're clearly stringed instruments, not like a guitar, but like they're being plucked in a way that is just like so haunting and so chilling.
Yeah. Fun fact. Do you know who did the score?
I did not. Was it Hans Zimmer?
Yeah, it's Hans Zimmer.
Ah.
No, it's not. It is Jonathan Richard Guy Greenwood, also known as Johnny Greenwood, the guitarist from Radiohead.
Really?
Yeah.
No shit.
Yeah. So I think overall, like, the music is so eerie throughout. It's very, like, it puts you on edge. There's a lot of like dissonance and like off. It's just really, it's very unsettling. And I think, like you said, what happens, and if you look at the scene, I think it's so masterfully done because like you said, the drums come in and it's still when things are like manageable. Like, yeah, there's oil everywhere, whatever. And it's very manageable, and the drums keep a consistent pattern. And then as the tension ramps up, more drums are added at different rhythms, and it creates this really like strange off-rhythm cacophony of percussive instruments that is directly equated to the chaos of the situation they're in. And as you see like the scene settle down, it falls back into a more consistent, like, one pattern rhythm.
To go and to kind of connect this back to, of all things, what we were talking about in the first song with the swell and like the cacophony, like it does that as well, where you just get this like swelling of just like all this noise that's just putting you on edge and making everything feel tense just for it to like crescendo and then kind of like just go back to normalcy as, like you said, as things are beginning to calm down. It was just an interesting, because we talked about the cacophony and it's like, this is kind of in a weird way connected, not in any other way except for like the way that we felt about that song and then this part of the movie.
Yeah.
But
it's crazy how much, it's almost like maybe the album is just about There Will Be Blood.
The whole album is about There Will Be Blood.
Yeah, but so from a story aspect, the most significant part of that scene is in the explosion of the gas. HW is blown off of the little roof that he's sitting on, and he becomes deaf.
I want to point out too, because we did talk about how he uses HW as a tool. When that first happened, that was the only thing on his mind, was getting HW and making sure he was safe. I mean, he does run up and like grab the hammer and like hit those, but he like, that's on his way to finding HW. Then they find him on top of the roof, like rolling around, and once he gets him, he's out of the situation.
Yeah,
he takes him and just completely gets out of it, back to like
I think he gives him to Fletcher, and he's like, "Watch my boy."
Oh no, Fletcher hands him to him, and then he takes him to the barracks.
Yeah, you're
like,
right.
He gets himself out of that situation too. So like, their well-being was still the first thing at the forefront of his mind.
Mm-hmm.
And I do want to point out, there's a morality part of it there, where we're like, where are his morals? Where do they come from? He did want to make sure that himself and HW were safe. But I do think that's because that's part of his business plan.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, and you see it in the film, in the following scenes, where he's trying to understand like what's going on. Like, we know HW is deaf now. Like, he cannot hear, and he's like trying to understand, like, is it just a temporary thing? Is it just a child acting strange? And like, he doesn't react well to
him being deaf.
Yeah, because now, whereas before, like, you see all these scenes where he's meeting with like businessmen, and he can be like, "This is my son," and like, he's such a well-off boy. And even there's a scene when they first get to the town that eventually becomes like the town that they build, where men are getting off the train, and they're like, "Oh, HW, like, if you ever need a lawyer, like, come to me. Like, make sure you get what you deserve from your dad." And it's like, he's set up as a very likable kid, like all these like very well-known businessmen like him, and then all of a sudden he's a problem. He's an impediment to the business actually occurring.
And I think there's parts of it too where, like, I don't want to say that the things he does starts to like annoy Daniel, but like, there's that scene where he's sitting there just like snapping into his, like, trying to be like, oh, maybe my sound will come back, but the kid's still, coming to terms with the fact that he's deaf, and his dad's just like, stop doing that, like trying to stop him from snapping in his own ear. And
a lot of weird like vocalizations too, like a lot of like
he's like groaning, like
humming, like, because and like, I guess at that point, like, he understands, like, he can probably hear the sounds that he is making just through the vibrations of like his skull,
feel
like,
them, not hear them so much, right?
And he's like as a kid, I imagine that's such a hard thing to accept.
Especially not being born that way. Like if you're born that way, it's like you're used to this. But he's like what 10 or 11 maybe at this point,
Yeah, I think so.
and like it's not there.
And then you see like him. The other thing that happens, and this really lends to this idea that everybody that I almost said Daniel has around is only kept around because they're of some use to him. Because right when this happens, a new character shows up. Our good friend
Henry, I believe is his name.
Let me see. Let me check my notes real quick. You think I would have written down? Yeah, Henry Plainview. So Henry Plainview shows up, and I think at this point, like Daniel's kind of just on edge because he's made money and he's making money. He's pretty well. It seems like he's well known, and someone shows up and it's just like, "Hey, I'm your brother," and he's like, "Yeah, okay," like I'm sure, but it seems legit. Like he has writings, he has photos, he has the information, and he lets him know like, "Hey, our dad died, and I wanted to come find you. Like I heard you're doing well." And something's up.
He definitely doesn't believe him, but then he's like, "Well, how did you find out if you weren't at home?" And he's like, "Well, I got the letter from I forget her name. It would have been his sister."
Mm-hmm.
And he sees the letter, and then he was like, "Okay, maybe this guy's who he says he is."
Yeah, and like the audience is kind of like stands in with Daniel too. We're like, this seems strange.
It's fishy.
But then HW has the most visceral reaction to this person arriving, and he is immediately like, there's something going on here.
When they're not there, he also goes through his journal.
Yeah, which brings us to the scene where like this is where rewatching it I was like, wow, this is such a like gut-wrenching part of the movie, because when Henry and Daniel go away, HW's kind of just, and you see this like when they're not around, when they're going to work, Daniel just gives HW milk with whiskey in it, and he's like, yeah, go to bed.
Yeah, fall asleep.
And he goes through Henry's journal, and he finds these pictures, and you're like, what is this? Like as an audience, I didn't immediately connect it, because I'm like, what's 2 and 2? Like what are we putting together here? And then that night, HW tries to light Henry on fire.
Yeah.
It's a very funny scene. Again, it's not really funny, but it's like this little kid in like his prospector jammies lights a trail of gas, oil.
I think it was an oil lantern. Yeah.
Yeah, and he like leads it from the door of the house to the bed
that Henry's
sleeping in, and they're freaking out, like trying to get the fire out. I assume the house burns down, because I don't think they get it out.
I don't think they do either, but you just see HW just standing in the doorway, like watching the whole thing.
Yeah, and then they're trying to put it out fairly unsuccessfully. You don't really see how that ends, but then Daniel just runs after HW, and like you can tell this is like, I'm at my wit's end. This child is a problem now. Like
he thinks he's acting out also at this point. It's like, okay, well now the kid's like, I'm deaf, and his brother showed up, so his brother is what Daniel thinks is going through HW's head.
Yeah,
but I'm pretty sure HW like read is like, oh, this guy's not his brother.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like children when they have like a parent has another kid, and they're like, I'm not the center of attention anymore. Yeah. Like they're gonna act out, and it's easy to assume that's what's going on. But we as the audience know that HW was doing some snooping.
Yeah.
But after this scene, what happens?
He sends him away.
In the craziest old Western style, I think it's a hard cut to both of them sitting on a train.
Yeah.
And in his infinite wisdom, Daniel is still trying to talk to HW. And he's yelling. He's like, they're sitting on a train, and he goes, I have to go talk to the conductor. I will be right back. Stay here. And HW's just like, okay. Like, just nodding. And Daniel just walks away.
And then the train starts moving.
HW's freaking out. Fletcher, his right-hand man, is on the train, makes sure HW doesn't get off of the train, but Daniel just walks away. And I don't think it's out. I think they do mention it. He sends him to like a school for the deaf.
Yeah, it's a school for deaf. I think he actually says it's like the teacher's the best teacher that they could have, and that they could send HW to. I think Fletcher was the one that sought out the school for him, because he's the one having the conversation. Like, this is where you want to send him.
Yeah, he does. I do remember that now. Yeah.
And Fletcher's on the train with him to take him there too, because the moment that the train starts moving, HW tries to get off of it, and Fletcher grabs him.
Yeah, and it's such a sad scene.
Yeah.
Like, that's where you continue to see, like, anyone who doesn't serve a purpose to Daniel, it doesn't matter. He will literally send them away. HW, he goes deaf. He can't be the tool that he's like, I'm a family man. And he's like, what am I going to do with this kid? And then his brother shows up and he's like, sweet, I can still be a family man. My brother, he can actually work with me. Like, he's an adult.
He's my partner now.
Yeah.
At this point.
So send HW away. I have my brother now. But then more and more starts to happen where he starts to realize, like, oh, is this actually my brother? And it all culminates in a very interesting scene.
I will say, to get into like some of, again, the morality of Daniel, because before we get to that point, we do see them at a business deal where somebody's trying to buy them out. They ask how HW is doing. He's like, oh, it's good, blah, blah, blah. Like, he's fine. This is my brother, blah, blah, blah. And then it gets to a point where he's like, why would I take this? He's like, well, you could go take care of your boy. And he gets super, super angry about, tell me how to raise my family.
Yeah,
He's
he
like,
walks away from that, doesn't he?
But first he goes, I'll find where you sleep and I'll come slit your throat.
Oh,
like, he
yeah.
threatens this guy. He's like, tell me how to run my family. We start to see the decline of Daniel, his psyche and like his sanity at this point, where it all starts to slip. Like, things fell apart with his business and then his son, and now things are starting to fall apart with Daniel himself.
Up until that point specifically, probably too, is he keeps his cards so close to his
He's very
chest.
calm and collected in almost every single situation he's in. But the moment he's just like, he thinks this guy's telling him he doesn't know how to run his family, he's like, no, that's not happening. We're not having that conversation.
Like you said, that's where you see his decline, because he really starts off as like, he is a really good, he might be scummy, but he's a really good businessman. Yeah. And he negotiates well. He makes good deals. You know, he doesn't give people like more than he's willing to give them, but it seems like he gives them pretty decent deals, or he negotiates well. And he's just like, I know what you have. I'll give you a little more than you're asking for, or something like that.
But he even states to them at this point, and this is going into like the success where things are on the up and up, and he starts getting happy. But like, he's like, they're like, well, you could build a pipeline out and make a deal with Union instead. And he's just like, I'll show you what I can do. And then he walks out.
And he does.
And he
he builds the pipeline. Yeah.
But not without, like, it goes through this frustrating period too where, he's staying partners with his brother. But he's like, what's going on? Why don't I own this? And they're like, don't you remember? Mr. Bandy wanted to talk to you, but you never went and talked to him. Mm-hmm. He's like, find out how I own that. I'm
glad you brought up Bandy, because that, going back to like the religious aspect of this, when there's one thing I wanted to, it connects to this, but when HW initially goes deaf, there's a point where Eli, he comes to Daniel and he's asking him for money, I think for the $5,000 that
Daniel just slaps him.
He smacks the life out of him. And he's like talking about, because he's asking for money to build the church. Obviously, just immediately you can see the religious angle of this, and it's kind of this idea that this religious traditional culture, whatever, is reliant on the more modern aspects of American life to fund it and build it. Like, he's relying on a businessman to build a church in which he can keep traditional values alive, but in the moment he smacks the life out of him.
I think it's another also, like, to go into show, like, we had the baptized in oil thing before, right?
Yeah.
So not only does he smack the shit out of Eli, he drags him over to like just mud that's created by oil.
Yeah.
And then just starts covering him in it to show, like, in my opinion, it's a show of like, this is your life now.
Yeah.
Like, no matter what, this is here. You're like, this is going to be what you have to deal with.
Yeah, we're not going back.
Yeah.
We're not like, this is the future. Like, post-industrial revolution America, this is what it's going to look like.
But I also do think that the whole, like, Daniel attacking him thing is just like, his son is injured. His operation kind of fell apart. And now this little worm is coming to ask me for the money I owe him. He's like, this is not the time to do it. And I'm going to make an example out of you right now.
Yeah. Do you remember what he says to him? Because he says, it's very subtle. It's very quick, but it speaks a lot to the kind of themes that we're talking about.
I don't remember what the line is.
So he's like, I need money to build a church. And Daniel goes, why can't you heal HW?
Oh, yeah.
So it's this idea of like, you're relying on me to build your church, but if I were to rely on you, could you heal my son?
Yeah. And
because we see the scene where they go to the church for the first time and he's doing like evangelical, like
taking the arthritis out of the lady's bones.
Yeah. And it's this mutual idea that Eli sees Daniel as like a hack, fraud, con man.
And Daniel sees the same thing in Eli.
Yeah. The dynamic is that of yin and yang, where it's like they each see the con man in each other, but they both rely on each other to some degree.
And I think also what might spurn the attack, because he does say, like, why can't you heal HW? But he's like, well, if you would have let me bless this, and then that's whenever a lot starts coming out.
To continue with that, so when he's building the pipeline and they're like, oh, well, remember that time that you said the Bandyland, you needed to go talk to him, and you were like, I'll buy him out later.
Yeah.
He eventually makes his way to the Bandy Ranch. The grandfather isn't there, and the grandson's like, he's never going to sell this.
Yeah.
But later in the movie, Bandy comes to Daniel. He finds him. I think at that point he's like blacked out drunk.
This is after the big thing with Henry.
Oh, yeah, we should talk about that. Yeah, for sure. So Henry his story starts to slip up.
He starts drinking real heavily, and so originally he comes there and he's like, I'm not here to ask you for money. I just want to work and like get money. But then he starts like really drinking, and like they're together drinking, and Daniel's calm and Henry's just like, I need money. Give me money. Like, I need money. And like, he's like, all right, like gives it to him. Things are kind of going well. They've got everything of their pipeline built up except for what the Bandy Ranch needs. And they're like swimming in the ocean and happy, like celebrating. And then that's whenever he says something about like, oh yeah, get drunk and go to the Peach Festival, or
it's when he starts to catch on, because he's like, do you remember that house?
Yeah.
And he's like, oh, so many houses. And he's like, no, there's one specific house. And he's like, Daniel is reminiscing to Henry about this house that he should remember. And he's talking about like, oh yeah, you could probably build a house like that here. And Daniel just goes, if I saw that house now, it would make me sick. And you start to understand like, okay, he's catching on to him.
Yeah.
And it culminates in a nighttime scene. Daniel pulls a gun on Henry and
wakes him up.
Yeah. He's like, who are you? Like, you're not my brother. Who are you? And it turns out that he was on, I think he just says, I'm no one.
I'll get my stuff and go.
Yeah.
Or he says, I'm your friend, and like,
yeah, you don't know who I am, but like we've built this relationship at this point. Like, I'm your friend. Turns out Henry just knew his brother. His brother had died of tuberculosis.
His brother did want to make his way with him to Daniel.
Yeah.
Like, and when his brother died, he's like, yeah, I took his journal, and like, we didn't have any money to get to you sooner, or we would have.
Yeah, he just adopted his brother's story. And essentially just tried to live his life as Daniel's brother. And Daniel shoots him in the head.
Yeah.
He shoots him in the head with the smallest pistol you could imagine. And then he buries him that night.
Then he drinks.
Yeah, he gets
heavily
blacked out drunk. And the next morning, Bandy, I don't remember.
Old man Bandy. I can't remember his first name.
Yeah, I don't know if they give him. I think they just call him Bandy. But he comes upon Daniel, wakes him up, and he's like, hey, if you want to buy my ranch, you have to get baptized.
Not only that, he says you have to become a member of the church.
Yeah.
Like, you have to become part of this community.
Yeah.
Like, Eli's been asking you for the money, and I think in Bandy's mind, the only way that's going to happen as if he becomes an active member in that community.
Yeah, because and again, that's kind of it speaks to the differences and like post like all of these things occurring. Like there is a sense of loss of community where the church was the community, and Daniel's like, whatever, dude. Like, what do you? Or he says something like, you gotta you need to get washed in the blood and get baptized, and he's like, why would I do that? And he's like, you sure you don't have any sins you want forgiven?
He's like, I know your sins.
Yeah, and he just looks at like the gun. He's like, oh, okay, you know, I just shot and killed that man and then buried his body.
And you're willing to forget it if I just become a member of the church? All right, I guess I could do that.
All right, I can do that. So yeah, he goes to Eli's church, and this is where the mirroring of kind of the baptism, the becoming part of like either the oil or the community, the church, progress, traditionalism, things like that. Even in the scene that you were describing where Eli first comes to, well, not first comes to, but he comes to Daniel and Daniel smacks him. Eli puts him through the ringer.
The funniest thing, and again, like, obviously not a funny movie, not a funny scene.
Mm-hmm.
This might be one of my favorite scenes in the movie, because, like, Eli does force him to scream that he's abandoned HW and, like, make him feel like a bad person the whole time.
That's brutal.
Yeah, but at the same time, like, when he's smacking the shit out of Daniel, Daniel's taunting him.
Yeah, he's just looking up and giving him, like, a...
And he says something about, like, oh, where's that? Oh, there it is. Like... That's like legitimately just taunting him. Like you said too, they recognize the con man in each other, and like it's one man just like, oh, where's your gumption? How are you going to convince these people that you are saving me whenever I don't want to be saved?
They recognize, like, I don't want this to happen, but it has to happen in order to progress my narrative.
Yeah.
And one of the other things that's so interesting about the scene is there's this aspect of like blood. Obviously the movie's called There Will Be Blood. The religious aspects of the idea of being washed in the blood of Christ, and then also like oil representing some kind of like blood of like this industry, America at this point. Right after Eli gets done just putting him through the gauntlet, he just pops up and he's like, there's going to be a pipeline.
Yep. I've succeeded.
I did it.
You don't realize, like, you think you're doing this thing to hurt me, but you've only just let me win even more.
I'm just going to come back stronger.
Yeah.
And then at this point, HW comes back. We can see it as the audience. The reasoning is Henry's gone. He needs someone.
He needs his partner. He needs his tool to make sure that people understand he's a family man.
HW comes back. We have a really weird scene in a restaurant when HW comes back with the guy who previously had been like, well, you could use this money to go take care of your son. Daniel is drunk, or he's just so gone at this point.
I think he's drunk with rage also whenever he just sees the man, because like they order their food and then they come in and order, and immediately as soon as they order, they bring out their drinks, and he was like, I ordered drinks before them.
He goes up to the bar and he takes their drinks. He's like, we actually ordered these first.
Yeah. And then he goes over and just throws it in that man's face. He's like, look how big of an idiot I am. Am I the idiot?
Yeah.
Say you're the idiot.
Yeah, it's such a, like, at that point, it's not even like at that point as an audience member, I want to be like, yeah, like, you did it. But at that point, it's so...
It's hard to. It's hard to, like, be on, because, like, it's like, you could have just been like, hey, look, here's my son. Look, I told you he's good.
Yeah, in a normal narrative, we would be rooting for Daniel, and that would be the scene where you're like, yeah, man, you did make it. Like, who cares about what everybody else said? But in this movie, it's like, we see how you got there. We see everything you did.
Yeah.
And, like, you're falling apart at the seams.
Yeah. It's still part of his decline. Even though he won, he is still in a decline.
Yeah, he's losing.
Yeah.
He's winning, but he is losing. And then go ahead.
I want to bring up, one of the only reasons I think he brought back HW is he has, like, the teacher come with him also.
Yeah.
So, like, not only is it like, oh, I have my reason to have a family, he has a translator for HW at this point now. And we do start to see also HW really, that relationship that he's been, like, making with the younger Sunday girl is becoming stronger as well. Like, they're playing, they're hanging out, they're going to church together.
Yeah.
Like, and we start to see this foster a lot more.
Yeah, so jump to 1927. HW gets married to the Sunday girl,
Yeah.
which her Mary Sunday.
I think it's Mary, yeah.
They all have strong Christian names.
Yes.
And the note that I have 1927. HW gets married. Daniel Day-Lewis is wildin'.
He is wild, to say the
He
least.
has a giant mansion. It's the Roaring Twenties. He's an oil man, and he's just shooting his rifle.
Yeah, in his house.
In his mansion. Also, fun fact. Did you recognize who adult HW is?
I did not.
Did you watch season 1 of Fargo?
Yes.
It's the deaf guy
Oh, no
in
shit.
Fargo.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, it's the same guy. I was watching it. I was like, he looks so familiar, but I didn't want to. It's like, it was like one of those things where it's like, am I in the wrong for thinking that deaf guy is the same deaf guy? in that
All
show?
deaf guys are the same, right?
Yeah.
Hopefully
And-
none of them are listening.
Anyway, no, that's staying in. You said it. I didn't say it. But yeah, I looked it up and I was like, oh, nice. That is him. Yeah. You get the sense Daniel Day-Lewis is thriving monetarily, financially, but he is losing his mind. And HW comes to him and says he's sitting there talking to him, to Daniel Day-Lewis, Daniel, and he says, like, I want to take Mary and I want to start my own business in Mexico.
Before that, though, like Daniel, I think the marriage and the coupling of like the Sunday girl and him has always kind of pissed him off a little bit because of his just hatred of Eli and like everything that Eli stands for. And so like even when he comes to talk to him, it seems like they haven't seen each other for a while, and he's mad that he has somebody interpreting for him.
Yeah.
He says, "I want to hear you say it."
Yeah, that's such an uncomfortable scene.
Yeah.
Because like he's like, if you want to talk to me, you can talk to me. Don't talk through your little dog.
Yeah.
And it's such an uncomfortable scene because like he's deaf.
Yeah.
He's not going to be able to talk well, and you're forcing him to put him in this like super uncomfortable situation for him, and like he eventually is just like, yeah, I'm gonna take my wife. We're gonna go to Mexico. And he's like, whatever, you're my competitor now.
Yeah.
I hope you know that. And that's when he tells him, he's like, you're not even my son. And he's like, you're a bastard. You're worse than a bastard.
Bastard in a basket.
Oh, it's such a brutal scene after everything you've seen HW go through.
Yeah. To find out like this man just took me after my father died.
And it would be one thing if he was like, you know what, no matter what, you're my boy. But the second you kind of give him like a pushback, he's like, no, you're a bastard in a basket.
The second you weren't useful to him anymore because you're his competitor, he's just like, no, we're not blood. Nothing about us is the same. There's
Yeah.
no reason to have this connection.
Yeah, and then HW, I think he says, I'm glad I don't have any of you in me.
Yeah.
Something along those lines. So that is almost the final straw. But guess who's back?
Guess who we find blackout drunk again, sitting in his own bowling alley in his mansion.
Yep, Daniel.
With just food all around him.
He's got
too.
a nice looking steak.
Yeah.
He's drunk in the middle of his bowling lane. And who's back but our good friend Eli, looking dapper as ever. I think he mentions how successful he's become as a preacher.
Because radio has helped him.
Exactly, yeah.
Right.
We know that video will eventually
Kill
kill the radio star.
We go from evangelist to televangelist. So
Yeah, I think he says Bandy is dead. He comes to tell Daniel that Bandy is dead, and because I think the deal originally with Bandy was he could put the pipeline, but he didn't own the land.
yes, he wasn't allowed to drill because that's what the kid said originally. The grandson, he's like, we don't want you drilling on this land. He's like, well, I'm not here to drill. Let me talk to your grandfather.
Yeah, but now that Bandy's dead, the grandfather Bandy, Eli comes to Daniel and he's like, I'm bringing you this deal. I want part of the money. Plus, I want interest on everything you've owed me up to this point. And, like, we're basically business partners now.
Because essentially what he tells him is that the grandson of Bandy went to, like, acting school. And he's going to move out of the land. He doesn't want the land. He's going to go to Hollywood because he's going to make it big.
Yeah, he's like, he's a very handsome boy.
Yeah, so he's like, so I'm telling you this so that you can now make a purchase, and just like what he doesn't know, Paul did, but you give me money to know this.
And, oh, man, the most notable part of this movie is the last scene. Is like the last,
absolutely.
like it's been. I remember even as a child, like this scene being talked about. But before we get into the part, yeah, the interesting parallel of, and again, these mirrored scenes. This is a mirror of the baptism that Daniel gets put through, where he's like, "I'll give you the money, but you have to admit you're a false prophet." And Paul is the real, or he says,
Paul was the real one.
yeah, Paul is the real prophet, and he informs him, like, Paul came to me, and Paul is the reason I came to your farm initially. And he goes, "I will make this deal with you, but you have to tell me you're a false prophet and God is a superstition." And he puts him in the same degree where he's like, Daniel has to scream in the church, like, "I abandoned my son." He's making Eli do this in a very similar way.
He keeps taunting him here too, because he's like, says it. He's like, say it like you're telling your church.
Yeah, exactly. He's like, do it like you would one of your sermons.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where it's such an interesting, like, mirror, and you see it throughout, where they're just this, like, it's cyclical.
Yeah.
They keep falling into the same trap of, like, I hate you more than anything in the world, and I want you to suffer. And then it keeps coming to bite each of them.
It always bites Eli a bit more.
Yeah, which ultimately, I mean, he gets bit the most.
Yeah.
So this is obviously the big scene. Before we get into, like, the most memorable parts, this is where Daniel goes, "It's drainage."
Yeah.
It's just drainage, which is the song title.
Because essentially what he's saying is like, you're trying to sell me this oil. I already have it.
Yeah.
He's like, mine. That's impossible. What do you mean? He goes, you don't know how this works. My favorite thing is the whole, imagine a milkshake and I have a straw. I drink your milkshake.
Yeah. He's like, if I have a milkshake and I'm all the way down here and you're all the way down there and I have a straw that's long enough to reach all the way to your milkshake, I drink your milkshake. Which is the most quotable thing from the movie. What everybody knows the movie. There's like the like sub context to it, where it's like they're always going at each other. Even if I had a milkshake in front of me, I hate you so much,
I'm gonna drink your milkshake.
Yeah, I would put more effort into making sure you don't have something than I can enjoy this and you can enjoy yours. And then ultimately they get into a very Benny Hill-esque chase scene, and eventually Eli gets his head bashed in by a bowling pin.
Yeah.
And one of the weirdest anti-climaxes, like, there's the climax of this scene, which is such a well done scene.
Yeah.
And then the butler walks in to the bowling alley, and you see Eli bleeding out, Daniel sitting there, and he just goes, he's like, Mr. Plainview? And he goes, "I'm finished."
Which is like, that line right there is so true on so many different levels.
Yeah, like he's done.
He's done.
Everything he's at this point, what does he have left to accomplish? He's presumably a millionaire in the roaring 20s. He's made an oil business. He has no family, and he killed his longest standing enemy.
And there's somebody there that also, like, chances are is, unless he's just going to pay him off and he can live with the morality of that, it's either he's going to go to prison or just, like, lose his butler.
yeah, one of the two. Like,
yeah,
like it, and if that is the implication, where he's like, him saying "I'm finished" is basically like, "Oh, I'm done. Like, this is it." Like, he doesn't care.
No,
he doesn't say it like, "I'm finished."
Yeah,
he's like, "I'm finished."
Yeah, I'm done.
He's excited.
Yeah,
and like, maybe it's the culmination of, like, everything like that because at this point, like, what, it starts in 1898, so we're like almost 30 years.
What'd you say it was 20 what at the 24?
27.
Yeah, so it's almost exactly 30 years.
So, like, at this point, he's probably close to the end of his life. Like, when we are introduced to him, he's not young.
No, he's probably close to his, like, upper 30s, early 40s.
Yeah, so it's like, what, like, you sit back and you reflect, and you have to imagine, to some degree, even with everything we know about him to this point, like what does he have? There's like the idea of I'm gonna put it in terms you'll understand. It's like Batman and Joker. If the Joker isn't around, like they're there to antagonize each other.
Yeah.
And he's lost his family, what little he had. His business is probably not run by him at this point. He's not on the front lines. He has all this money, but what is he going to do with it? Can he enjoy it? He sits in his house and he shoots bottles. And then
That's what I hope to do whenever I make it
that'd be
someday.
so cool. Have a big enough, just like you're doing real estate like searches, and the real estate agent's just like, yeah, I found a hallway with the dimensions you were looking at, and you just bring your gun. And you're like, yeah, I could probably shoot some bottles from here. But all of these things, like, and then the only thing that probably is keeping him alive is his hatred for Eli, and wanting to have the ultimate win over him. And he kills him. He wins. He's finished. What does he have at this point? He has
Nothing to live for.
nothing. So yeah, I mean, every time I watch this movie, I love it a little more.
It's that kind of movie. It's like there are movies that are just like that, where it's like you watch it the first time, you're like, damn, that was good. You watch it the second time, you're just like, holy shit. Like there's so much more that I've noticed on a second watch through, and that just like keeps happening. Like
Yeah.
that's one of those things. Like there are movies that I'll say, we talked about this earlier, movies that I think, oh, so you should watch them at least once in your life. This is a movie that I'll continue to watch throughout my life, just because like it is so impactful in these scenes as well. Like all the scenes that we talked about were like the first baptism of Daniel, and then like like both those are such powerful scenes. Like they're so intense, so uncomfortable feeling, but like they matter so much to both of those characters. And it just watching it over and over again, like it never loses that feeling as you got the first time you watch it.
Yeah, no, it is. It continues to have the same impact. Like, I talk about this a lot with the difference between Good Time and Uncut Gems. Good Time feels the same every time you watch it. It's super tense, but like it never loses that feeling. Uncut Gems really does benefit from the first time you watch it.
Yeah, it's you watch it the first time, you're like, holy shit, and then you know what's gonna happen, so it's like
Yeah, it loses a little bit of its impact, but in the same regard, like There Will Be Blood does not lose its impact. Yeah, it's just every time I watch it, I appreciate it a little more, and it's hard to recommend not because of like how tough to stomach at times it is, but like it is a very slow burn. It's very methodical. It's really well shot. It looks visually great. There's amazing performances. The score is like one of the biggest contributors to the film, but it's definitely not a film for everybody. I would recommend it to everybody. I think everybody should watch it.
I think everybody. It's to me, I will watch it forever, but I think everybody should watch it at least once. It is a slow burn, like you said, maybe one of the slowest. It pays out so much.
Yeah, the as much as you're anticipating, and I think it does a decent job of like kind of breadcrumbing you. Like you get enough high impact scenes throughout that it never feels like you're just like waiting for something to happen. But
I think it. I don't want to say it's mislabeled as a genre, because like if you look at genres, it'll say it's a Western.
yeah, it's
This
not,
isn't typically what you think of a Western. You think of like cowboys, like gun shooting, stuff like that.
Yeah.
There's one gunshot, well, aimed at a person in this entire movie.
yeah.
Or like there's not that good versus bad. There is good versus bad. Actually, I think it's more of just bad versus bad. Like it's evil versus evil in this a lot.
Not even bad versus evil. It's like it's this weird ambiguity where like we see the good and bad in everybody, and then it's like what are we most willing to put up with and identify
Yeah.
with? Like where it's just such a it's so ambiguous. And yeah, that's not the Western. You don't have John Wayne, Clint Eastwood like
Yeah.
rolling up to a town and being like, I'm gonna solve your problem. But yeah, I don't know. It's a great movie. I think it's probably one of the best movies I've ever watched, I would say.
Easily.
Fun fact, and before when we sat down to hit record, we were talking about this, and I told you, let's not talk about this. I have something to talk about. So There Will Be Blood, released 2007. So I checked out the 2008 Oscar Awards, and Daniel Day-Lewis won Best Actor in a Leading Role for, obviously, There Will Be Blood, and it also won an Oscar for cinematography. However, it lost in the directing category, the best picture category, and the best adapted screenplay category. And it's so interesting because another film came out in 2007 that's an adapted screenplay is, I would say, just as impactful and amazing of a movie.
Was that No Country for Old Men?
It is No Country for Old Men.
Yeah.
That's the Coen brothers, correct?
Yes, yeah.
They won Best Directing, they won Best Picture, and then Best Adapted Screenplay for, obviously, it's an adaptation of Cormac McCarthy's No Country for Old Men. And that kind of, like, it blew me away. I was like, wow, those two movies came out at the exact same time, and, like, they were up against each other.
Yeah.
It's such a...
Well, they both deserve the awards that they have won.
Yeah,
like sure. Both in acting and in direct, like cinematography and like all that, because both phenomenal movies. Mm-hmm. I can't imagine there's any way that we won't end up covering No Country for Old Men, because I know that you really love the novel as well as the movie. Mm-hmm. I can imagine us probably covering a lot of Coen Brothers things, because they're probably a reason that I love this. Like, in that DVD cabinet over there is a Coen Brothers shelf, because my parents were such huge fans of them.
Yeah, there's definitely no way we can't talk about.
Yeah,
especially like Fargo,
No Country for Old Men. I don't think The Big Lebowski fits in that generally not feeling rad category, but yeah, well, it's a great one.
Something like Burn After Reading.
Yeah, that one.
You're just like at the end, you're like, huh, all right. But yeah, all right. Well, hey, episode 1, Existential Shred. Stick around or don't.
Or don't.
One of the two. I don't know.
It would kind of be fitting if they didn't.
Yeah. Find us in the bowling alley and kill us with a bowling pin. All right. Later.